so I said something in the back. It was an energy, and so I got confused of who was talking.
Who's talking me? It's quite in the back.
That's right.
In the back. Please stop. But yeah, you're on the monitor.
Yeah,
you're like paying attention to how you're sitting, and you're like awkward. What just made that face? Who made that face? Look up. Look up.
Okay, I'll go ahead. My name is Zachary Hodges. I'm president of Houston Community College Northwest, and we're here tonight at our Spring Branch campus, and I'm president of our Katy campus. We're building a new one over from U of H, Katy, and our Westheimer Hayes Road campus in the A-Leaf community. We're delighted to have the World Affairs Council here tonight. I've recently been appointed to the board of the World Affairs Council, and I was delighted about that, so I'm a newbie. But our students in our community can only benefit from the types of programs, the high caliber programs that are offered through the World Affairs Council. Really, really excited about it. I'm wearing a tie I got when I visited Korea with the Korean community here in Spring Branch. And it just reminds me that the world is getting smaller and smaller and smaller. And issues that we see are going on somewhere else are also going on here locally. So I was really happy to see that we are hosting this tonight, and that it's an important local topic. It's a worldwide topic. And I will, again, just be anxious to hear and see what I can do to make a difference around this issue.
Thank you very much, Dr. Hodges. And thank you all for coming here. And I know the much bigger and larger audience watching at home. As you all know, we often cover what's going on all around the world. Some important, stressful issues, whatever corner of the globe might be taking place. But this is a very crucial, important issue happening right here in Houston, right here in Texas, that I think is important to cover. So I also just want to let you know this is our first event for our West Houston chapter. A lot of you have been to our events in Central Houston, the Galleria area, or downtown, or the Heights, and Midtown. We've had events in the Woodlands for a long time, but we're now branching out and doing events on the West Side, and we're doing events down in Sugarland. So this is our inaugural event for the West Side, and if you can join us, we'll have another event on October 28th. And again, I'd like to extend a special thank you to Dr. Hodges and everyone at Houston Community College and Dr. Medel. It's wonderful to be here with you all, and more importantly, we love interacting and hosting and having your students attend our events. And if you can make it on the 28th, in about 2 weeks, we have an event called Who's Responsible for the World's Refugees? So about the refugee crisis, and really in a lot of ways what can be done to work with it, not resolve it completely, but work on it. That'll be our next West Side event, West Side chapter event on October 28th. And if you just don't mind going into Central Houston or watching online, we have an event next Thursday, October 21st, in the Galleria area called The State of U.S. Intelligence and the Challenges of the Years to Come. And that's with Stephen Slick. He served for 28 years in the CIA's clandestine service. A better way of putting it, the clandestine service, those are the spies and the spy masters and the case officers, the ones spying and recruiting spies. And he was later appointed Senior Director for Intelligence Programs and Reform for the National Security Council. And to introduce our excellent panels of speakers this evening, I'm delighted to welcome my great colleague, Jahan Jafapour, who is the Global Young Professionals Program Manager for the Council. And lastly, just as a note, you might notice that Representative Ann Johnson is not here this evening due to the third special section that's going on in the Texas House right now. She is still in Austin and unable to attend. So we'll get her back another time. And please welcome my colleague, Jahan.
Thank you. Without further ado, I'll introduce our speakers for our panel this evening. First, we'll have Sergeant Robert Medel. He is the supervisor of HPD's Human Trafficking Rescue Alliance. He's been at the Houston Police Department for 16 years. He's worked his first assignment in 2005 as a patrol officer out of the Central Patrol Area for 3 years. Sergeant Medel then worked on the Central Divisional Gang Unit for 1 year. In 2009, he began working in the Narcotics Division as an undercover investigator for 8 years and gained extensive knowledge in warrant executions, undercover operations, confidential informant management, and case preparation for the state and federal prosecution levels. In 2019, Sergeant Medel transferred out to the Vice Division as the Night Shift Club Task Force Supervisor, where he was tasked with supervising club raid options and club undercover operations to enforce local and state laws, as well as TABC violations. Dennis March is the Task Force Coordinator for the Human Trafficking Rescue Alliance Task Force of the Southern District. He began with Redeemed Ministries in 2006 and served as the Executive Director from May 2001 until July 2020. He also spent 7.5 years serving as the house dad in the restoration programs Safe House, learning how to understand the effects of trauma and how it interferes with victim interviewing and healing. He also worked with the Not for Sale campaign from 2009 to 2012, serving as a chief investigator and content instructor for the Not for Sale Investigator Academy and the Strategic Mapping Backyard Academy. While with Not for Sale, Dennis worked with grassroots efforts and law enforcement agencies across the United States, the Republic of Korea, Canada, Uganda, South Africa, Australia, and Brazil. Dennis now serves as the Task Force Coordinator for the Human Trafficking Rescue Alliance Task Force. He is responsible for coordinating law enforcement, anti-trafficking agencies, and community leaders' efforts utilizing a trauma-informed approach in identification, investigation, and restoration processes of anti-human trafficking law enforcement work and the provision of trauma-informed care to victim and survivor service agencies. Lastly, we do have Chris Graves. He is the Associate Director on Human Trafficking and Domestic Violence in the Office of Mayor Sylvester Turner. Under Mayor Turner's leadership, Chris co-wrote the Phase 1 and Phase 2 of Houston's Anti-Human Trafficking Strategic Plan with the Special Advisor to the Mayor on Human Trafficking, who is now the Director. In the nation's first comprehensive municipal response meant to it's the nation's first comprehensive municipal response meant to effectuate systems change. Once the Anti-Trafficking Division completed 100% of Phase 1 and 84% of Phase 2 in under 4 years, Mayor Turner expanded the division to include domestic violence while remaining focused on human trafficking. Chris co-wrote with the director the current Mayor's Office of Human Trafficking and Domestic Violence strategic plan that addresses violence and accelerates economic empowerment across many impact pathways. Chris is a Fulbright Scholar alumnus. He has a BA in German from the University of Texas at Austin and a BA in Philosophy from the University of Houston downtown. And moderating today's event, we do have our programs coordinator, Tatiana Uglis.
So I probably won't be using a microphone just because there's one of them and 3 of our speakers. So thank you, Dennis, Chris, and Robert, so much for agreeing to be on our panel today about human trafficking and how governments and different agencies respond to human trafficking and make sure that our victims feel safe and everything. So to start off, why don't you guys give a little bit about what exactly your certain departments do in relation to human trafficking and what you guys do in terms of victims. Dennis, would you like to start?
I can, yeah. Can everybody hear me okay?
Yeah.
Projecting good enough? All right. So, again, I am the Task Force Coordinator for the Human Trafficking Rescue Alliance of the Southern District of Texas. The task force operates under what's called a Enhanced Collaborative Model Grant from the Bureau of Justice Assistance under the Office of Justice Programs under the Office of Justice Department. And so our task is to fund law enforcement agencies in order to identify and investigate human trafficking cases here in the greater Houston area in the Southern District of Texas. So we identify, we investigate, and then the third component of our mission is that we make sure we address the needs of victims that we identify. And so we work with local law service providers to provide those services. We have identified 7 categories of care so that when we identify a victim, we identify their needs and then we address those needs with those different categories of care. So I work directly with YMCA International, their Trafficking Persons Assistance Program. And so when we recover a victim, we contact them and then we start the process of getting them services. So that's really my role. I actually participate in operations and evaluate how we interact with the victims we encounter to make sure that we're adhering to the policy procedures that are aligned under our grant requirements. So that's really my role.
Amazing. Thank you. Chris, what about yourself?
Yes, definitely. So in the Office of the Mayor, we have the strategic plan, which is a comprehensive municipal level response. So there are traditional law enforcement responses and there are established responses across federal, state, county, and city leaders. But of course, what's the opportunity at the municipal level? What does the trafficking response look like at airports, Office of Business Opportunity, procurement, health? What are the touch points for a healthcare worker who is staffing a WIC station to also screen for human trafficking? So there are a lot of different municipal opportunities that we seek to leverage. So the plan has gone through about 3 different phases. We completed 100% in phase 1, about 84% in phase 2. But I want to be a little bit more concrete in terms of what the plan encompasses. So really it has 5 core objectives. 1, we institutionalize the City of Houston's response. So we look at different departments. I've already named a few. We understand their day-to-day duties and what are the potential points we can leverage to incorporate a trafficking response. I'll give you one example. We want to make sure that those workers who are working on city contracts are paid a fair wage, are not recruited unethically. So we work with the Office of Business Opportunity to do contract screenings of those contract workers to make sure that they are paid fairly. That's just one example. We also engage in policy advocacy, and really the position of Special Advisor to the Mayor on Human Trafficking is really a policy level position. That means what are the policy level tools available to the City of Houston to affect change at scale, whether that's countering illicit massage parlors, whether that's addressing hotels as venues for commercial sex and human trafficking, or even addressing labor trafficking along the city's supply chain. Now really with the second objective, we want to raise awareness at scale. So there were previous kind of PSA media campaigns. Oftentimes they relied on free placements by TV stations. We wanted to up the game, so we had the Watch for Traffic media campaign, which was a multimodal media campaign. We ran across 2 phases to really drive awareness of the national hotline because we wanted people to know what trafficking is, not just sex trafficking, but also labor trafficking in different industries and venues you might not be aware of. Restaurants, traveling sales groups, carnivals. We want also that kind of victimization to be reported. So we created about 90 million impressions, and we saw an 80% increase in calls to the national hotline. With the third objective, we want to coordinate victim services. That means what's the role of the mayor's office in coordinating services and not duplicating what someone else is already doing. We saw 2 big needs: access to shelter and housing, access to medical and psychological services. For shelter, we created a shelter collaborative that eased access and allowed partner agencies to place victims in crisis with 1 of 2 shelters. Once they're in the shelter, they undergo a housing intake and can access longer-term housing. And we know that housing is a stabilizing force. And really with medical and mental health care, we have a dual case management system where we have case managers at the shelter and at the hospital level, so that way they have expedited referrals to medical and mental health care needs. The fourth objective is to coordinate affairs through Mayor Turner's policy level task force, the Houston Area Council on Human Trafficking, and really that more leverages public-private partnerships. And with the fifth objective, we want to establish Houston as the national municipal model, the city that other cities look to understand how to do a municipal response. To give you one example, we hosted a 10-10 session where we trained 24 senior level staff from 18 mayor's offices. Chicago, New York, Los Angeles, Dallas, Austin. We even have smaller municipalities, Everett, Massachusetts, Apex, North Carolina, for them to understand what is the municipal response, what are the needs in my city, and how can I then incorporate trafficking response in my role in the city, whether you work in housing, whether you're the town mayor, what have you. And so really my role is to not only to execute the strategic plan, but also ensure operational efficiency across all objectives of the plan.
Thank you, Chris. What about yourself, Sergeant Medel?
So my role is not as glamorous as Chris's over here. So I'm a supervisor / sergeant with the Houston Police Department, and I'm currently assigned to the Vice Division Human Trafficking Rescue Alliance, where I supervise a group of 6 officers who are detectives who are trained and very skilled in investigating human trafficking complaints or tips. There are 2 groups of human trafficking in our unit. I supervise one, there's another supervisor who supervises another one. So what my role is to filter through and sift through tons and tons of tips, emails, call-ins, complaints, reports that we get with the Houston Police Department that are all human trafficking related. Anything that has some viable information that I know that that has some solvability to it, I'll issue out to my investigators and have them do follow-ups, go out to scenes where patrol officers have come into contact with a possible victim. So that's one aspect of what we do. We also do operations where we're recovering juveniles, either by conducting hotel operations, which are usually called, for us, in-calls and out-calls. We'll go out, do an operation where I have my male UCs calling girls in who have posted ads on the internet. These girls come in, we'll do a case on them, and after the case is made, we'll try to figure out what is your situation. Are you a victim? Are you going to make an outcry? Or are you just doing this because you're in a tight situation and you can't get out of it? After we found out what's going on with their situation, Dennis Mark will get Dennis involved with the advocacy and resources to provide to them. That way they don't feel like it's just a law enforcement deal and you guys are targeting me. No, we're actually here to try to help you. Okay, we're trying to get you out of the life and provide some resources to you. So that's pretty much what my role is.
Amazing. So actually something you said brings me to my first question. It has a little bit of a conspiracy twist to it. Have you guys, has there been, I guess, has QAnon and other conspiracy theories made your jobs a little bit harder in terms of potentially getting false tips about random things, or just things that people think are there that aren't really there?
So we definitely deal with the aspect of tips that come in where it's obvious that the person may or may not be a consumer, as we call them. So yeah, there is a lot of filtering that goes on my part. It's not uncommon for me to make a quick phone call to make that determination. But as far as the QAnon conspiracies, the Houston Police Department deals with facts, testimony, and evidence, and that's what we base our cases on.
Okay, thank you. So just as a little bit more generalized question, what types of industries do you all see human trafficking most involved with? Not just sex trafficking, but all aspects of human trafficking. And that can be for anyone.
Sure, I can give some maybe introductory remarks. So recently, Polaris operates the National Human Trafficking Hotline. So as part of that, they released the Typology of Modern Day Slavery, which combed over about 10 years of calls and cases, and they identified 25 venues and industries in which human trafficking occurs. So not just a list of massage parlors, but also a lot of different venues for labor trafficking. That can be trafficking sales crews, that can be instances of domestic servitude. It can also be in hospitality and leisure, even the hotel industry. So it's a lot of different industries and venues we don't typically hear of. More often than not, we hear about a list of massage parlors or more street-based in the commercial sex industry.
Yeah, I would agree with that. Also, when you're looking at services-based industries, that's where you're going to find the potential, the vulnerabilities for trafficking to occur. A lot of people don't even realize that even if you go to a nail salon, that there's a lot of times that person could be an actual trafficking victim. And so it's just really hard to see, because to identify a victim in that situation, they're not going to know that they're a victim. And so they're not going to give you typically the indicators you think you're going to look for. And so they'll perform their jobs, they'll do whatever they have to do, but you don't understand the level of coercion on the background that's going on. So there's difficulty in identification. So every level of service industry could be a potential trafficking situation. So it's not like it's easy to spot. So that's one of the difficulties. There's a broad berth of opportunities there for vulnerabilities to be exploited.
Some of the industries that we typically see are the entertainment industries, strip clubs, nightclubs, any kind of night bar, after-hour clubs. You get these girls in there who are providing a service in their mind, but in actuality, like Dennis said, there may be some other factors going on there that got them into that position. We also see it in the hospitality industry. A lot of girls use hotels and motels. Guys use them also. So yeah, they're havens for sex trafficking.
Oh, and then also I was just going to say, and then also, it's really important to distinguish industries and venues. It also informs the type of outreach you do and the type of intervention you do, because victims look very different based upon the venue and the industry you look at. So, for example, a trafficking victim in an illicit massage parlor doesn't necessarily look like a trafficking you may see in the commercial sex industry that is victimized. So really, when we're talking about different industries, that has to inform the kind of intervention type of outreach that we're doing. And that's also culturally and linguistically sensitive to the victims we're encountering.
So that actually brings me to one of my next questions. What do you think is something that's most misunderstood about human trafficking? Because I know a lot of people, when they think of human trafficking, they think of sex trafficking, they usually think of a college girl who might have been kidnapped, or just like a prostitute, or something a sex worker, or something along those lines.
I think one of the biggest aspects of misunderstanding about human trafficking is if you would do a Google search today on trafficking and human trafficking, the images you're going to see, if you do an image search, you're going to see someone with a black eye and with their hands bound or handcuffed or chained or something. And that's typically not what you're going to see in this situation. So I think the biggest misunderstanding is that they are kidnapped. The movie Taken was a really bad kind of example. While it does happen, it's not the majority of the cases. I think one of the largest misunderstandings with it is you have to understand that human trafficking really thrives on the exploitation of vulnerability of an individual. And so that can be either economic or social or relational, whatever it is that's there. When traffickers are looking for their victims, they're looking at identifying that vulnerability and how can I exploit that for my needs. That's really where that comes down to. So a lot of the victims, I've done a lot of training with law enforcement, and you don't see the typical victim crying out for help. And so I remember a case early on, we were going to investigate a massage parlor, and the victim actually drove herself to the massage parlor. So it kind of blows the theory that she's there against her will because she had freedom to go and come and go. So what's going on in the background? And so when you understand the vulnerabilities that are there and how the traffickers manipulate that person by using their trauma that they may have already experienced against them to manipulate them to do that. And so that's one of the biggest things, is you can be standing in line behind a trafficking victim and never know it. But you just can't see what's going on in their life.
Yeah, just to kind of reiterate also, most people think that victims, that they're just going to come out and tell everybody that they're a victim. And that's just not the case. Not all victims want to be rescued. We'll come across girls every day, and it's just mind-boggling that the trafficker's outside waiting for them, and they're sitting here telling you, you're trying to get them open up to you, and they're sitting here telling you, no, he's my boyfriend, I love him, and we're in a dating relationship. So without her testimony and telling us that, yeah, he is trafficking me, we can't do anything. So it's very frustrating because that trafficker has brainwashed this victim into thinking that he loves her and that he's in a dating relationship with her, when he's probably got 3 other girls that he's doing the same thing with. So yeah, it's very frustrating.
And I guess I'll say two things, and kind of to build on what Dennis was saying as far as vulnerabilities. And really, these vulnerabilities cut across gender, race, ethnicity. Oftentimes when we're talking about trafficking and you see images and sensational media campaigns, there are one particular gender, one particular race, ethnicity. And I think we have to realize and really broaden the discussion and get a more inclusive view about who is victimized. They can be LGBTQ, they can be homeless people, they can be immigrants and refugees, they can have, they're maybe undocumented, have an illegal status, and the trafficker uses that to then leverage, as a point of leverage to then exploit them. So really trying to have a broader understanding of those victims. And go ahead.
No.
And then really the second point is there is one misunderstanding that comes up a lot, and it feels like we do have to kind of correct the narrative, is the smuggling trafficking differentiation, because oftentimes you may see in a local news story incident of human trafficking, but it may just be a smuggling incident, right? And I'm sure HPD knows this very well. And I'm sure the tips you get, you have to differentiate a lot.
Yes.
So for example, with smuggling, there's that movement across an international border. With trafficking, you can be trafficked in your own city of birth. The movement is not a necessary element, although it may have.
Yeah, with trafficking, it's the use of force, fraud, or coercion to get somebody to do something against their will, basically.
Yeah, and the complexity of that actual exploitation is so difficult to really understand, especially the coercion piece, because it is that manipulation of that individual. And so that's where, when we look at the vulnerabilities that are there, it's not just people who, as Chris said, come from a particular group of people. It can be anyone. We have recovered victims who came from really nice neighborhoods, really nice homes, with really good parents, who went to college and had degrees, who were manipulated into being trafficked. And so we have to get rid of the stereotypes, I think, that who a victim really is, because it covers all boundaries of a person's population.
Can one of you or all of you touch on maybe what are some of the signs to look out for that might indicate that someone is either being trafficked or is working against their will, essentially?
Sure. So some of the things that we come across are a change in demeanor, and there's no better person than to recognize this than someone's own family member. So we usually try to talk to family members about how's your daughter or son, whoever it is, coming to this position. We ask them, was there a change in their demeanor? Did they start hanging around in a crowd at school? Did you notice a change in their dress? There has to be some kind of internal change within that person that somebody recognized. So those are just a few of the things we tend to look out for. Mm-hmm. Somebody who's a little deeper into the life of trafficking, we look for stronger signs as far as what some of the things are. Tattoos. What kind of? A lot of the traffickers tend to brand their victims with the trafficker's name, the change in the dress. We look at their phone, and the traffickers usually have the victim save their name under some kind of form of daddy with a crown or something like that. But there are signs to look for, and those are usually some of them.
And then as far as on the labor trafficking side, and if we're thinking maybe kind of industry specific, so for example, in restaurants, oftentimes a foreign national may think they're applying to one particular job overseas, that they apply, they may incur a debt as a result of traveling there. It may turn out that instead of working in big tech, they're working in a restaurant. They may have their documents withheld, so for example, their passport. They may live and work in the same place. Their freedom of movement may be constricted where they're not allowed to go out. And then there's the fear that, the employer is saying, well, no, your legal status is lapsed. You're not legal in this country. If you report to the police, they're going to deport you. So they then use that against them. And oftentimes those labor trafficking indicators can be in different industries and venues, but that's just a few examples.
I think one of the important aspects of this, and people tend to get away from this very common method of connecting to a potential victim, and that's actually having a conversation with them. My wife, she understands trafficking very well. When she goes to our nail salon, she has a conversation with her head, and she asks them, "What did you do this weekend? How was your week?" And if there's a normal conversation going on there, that's a pretty good indication that this person's all right. But if they say, I didn't do anything this weekend, I don't do this, I don't do that, then there's a warning sign that we can look at. Or restaurant staff, same thing. I've been to a lot of restaurants where you see wait staff who are engaging with one another and maybe some banter going on between them. If you have wait staff in this restaurant and there's no connection, there's no personalities being displayed between them, that's a warning sign. So it's that human behavior that has been altered that is far from normal. Just think about what your life would look like if it was in a normal situation. If you see something that's abnormal, then usually that's something that you want to look at and possibly call someone on. It may or may not be anything, but again, you never know, because restaurants are becoming more popular with trafficking. There's some cases that will be coming up soon that you'll see some examples of that. So that there are out there. It's just hard. It's really hard to definitively say this and this and this. While there are resources from the Polaris Project's website, it give you a kind of a list of things to look for, but sometimes those are harder to identify.
It's difficult with the labor trafficking, especially because you may have an instance of wage theft.
Right.
That is an element of labor trafficking, but not necessarily labor trafficking. So there can be a continuum of exploitation where you may have wage theft but not labor trafficking.
Right. Yeah, I mean, the very first case that I ever worked with the law enforcement on was back in 2009, and that case was a domestic nanny. She was living in the home taking care of the kids, and she was a labor slave. And the person trafficking her was actually an INS agent for the federal government. Wow. And he had falsified her documentation. And the only reason they found her is because they were investigating him, because he was trading green cards for remodeling work in his house. And so during the investigation, they discovered this woman who didn't fit into the household. And they identified her, interviewed her. She confirmed what the situation was. And when they started the search warrant, the woman committed suicide. And so they didn't really have a human trafficking case, but we ended up getting her services. But nobody questioned it because she was just a part of this family. She went with them to dinner, she did different things, and so nobody ever knew. And this went on for 16 years in the woodlands. And so nobody knew. And so it can be right there in front of you, just not be aware of it.
Can you guys, I know that, like you guys said, most victims aren't kidnapped off the street, aren't necessarily always coerced. Can you guys touch a little bit about what the typical process is for someone to get groomed, I guess you could say, and then trapped within human trafficking?
We don't have the time. I just actually just did a training today with Texas Alcohol Beverage Commission on this very thing. And it's actually talking about the stages of entry. It's also known as the grooming process and what that looks like. And it all really starts with, in most cases, not all cases, in most cases, the childhood. You have to look at, there's a thing called attachment theory and how that attachment theory affects the child development. And that is one of the quickest vulnerabilities that a trafficker can exploit in that situation. And so the grooming process is simply to manipulate that person into a false sense of security through a sincere or surprisingly sincere relationship, and playing in those vulnerabilities and those risks that are there and using that against that person. And then the next phase is, and Robert talked about this earlier, changing the behavior of that individual, separating them from their support systems, their family, their friends. And when you see that happening, that's a good indication that somebody's being groomed. It's when that child becomes rebellious that the dangers are really there. And so it's just a process of separating them. It's sort of like the old saying, you're separating the weak from the herd in order to take this person down. That's what a trafficker does. He separates them from their support system and manipulates them into believing it's their choice. And it's not really a choice. He's removed all other options for them. And so now this person becomes dependent upon that individual, and they are willing to do whatever this person wants in order to maintain a relationship. And so it's very tricky. I'm actually meeting with a survivor this weekend who's been out of the life for 7 years, college educated. Her trafficking was supposed to, her grooming process, the pimp told her, hey, we're only going to do this for 30 days. And then you can stop and you can do whatever. that 30 days turned into 6 years. 7 years out of life now, she still struggles with the fact that he didn't force her to do this. And so that it's something that's residual in them for a long time because of all the manipulation that goes on.
I like to separate them into two different categories. That first initial contact that this trafficker has with his victim is usually what I like to refer to as the Romeo phase. He's nice to her, he gives her things, he takes her places, he's grooming her to eventually do what he's gonna do to her and basically traffic her. And if not at that, also sexually assault her. Once he knows he's got her in his grasp, he's taken this victim away from their support system. Now he's got her where he wants her. He usually takes her away from the city that she's from, away from that support system, away from family, away from her friends, to where he's got her by himself. Now that second phase kicks in, and he turns into the pimp. He's gonna force her to go out and do what he wants her to do. He's gonna force her to have sex with men, possibly even with himself. So yeah, those are the two phases that I like to break them down into.
The famous line that a pimp will use with the girl he's preparing to coerce into this is, hey, I need you to do me a favor. If you love me, you'll do this for me. So when she says no, the next line comes out of his mouth. And I've had a majority of women tell me they use this line. Then you must not love me as much as I love you, or you do this for me.
They also resort to violence.
Yep.
If the girl says, no, I'm not going to do this, well, then here comes the violence, the assaults start happening, the sexual assaults, and they have nowhere to go. So they're kind of stuck with this guy. This guy already took their credit cards, their IDs, their passports. They have no money. Whatever money that they do make, this guy takes from them. So yeah, they're very dependent on these traffickers, and that's why they get stuck in the life for so long, because they think that they're in a committed, loving relationship with this guy.
And then the other aspect of the part that plays into that piece is the trauma aspect, and their brain literally is physically broken because of the trauma. A lot of what we understand right now about the trauma associated with trafficking comes from the studies that have been done on the trauma associated with sexual assault. Well, most sexual assaults, it's a one-time event. For trafficking, when you have a girl who's been coerced into having sex with somebody that they really don't want to, right? That's a sexual assault. And so we're talking anywhere from 8 to 10 sexual assaults a day over a period of a year, right? So you're dealing with a person who literally has a physically broken brain as a result of trauma. And so trying to get them to make decisions, logical decisions, is almost impossible.
And I think there's also, to build on what Dennis is saying, also secondary victimization. And oftentimes when we're talking about trafficking, oftentimes the trauma preceded that.
Correct.
So for example, we had a human trafficking psychology fellow staffed at Benton Hospital who screened patients in the inpatient psychiatric unit. As part of those screenings, she did ACE scores, so adverse childhood experiences. Basically, sociology or psychology, you kind of know the scoring system. And she found that, and this is of course nationally known, that there is a correlation between ACE scores and vulnerability to trafficking. So adverse childhood experiences, mistreatment, physical and sexual abuse, yelling, isolation, those all factor into adverse childhood experiences, which create that vulnerability, which is then latched onto by traffickers.
A lot of times it's not what they're running to, it's what they're running from, right? So that really keeps the vulnerability that gets exploited.
Yeah, if you guys notice, what we're saying is there's a big push for vulnerabilities. These traffickers, they prey on girls who are vulnerable, and so girls who are in the CPS system or who are in the FPS system, and they get to CPS for some reason or another because the parents don't want them, or the step parents don't want them. So somebody's going to want them. So that's who these guys, they go after. They go after the girls who are very vulnerable and have low self-esteem issues.
Can you touch on what FPS is?
DFPS, Department of Family Protective Services.
Okay, and CPS, that's Child Protective Services, correct?
Yes.
Okay. How do your departments go about doing long-term follow-up?
All right, so for the task force, again, we have a mission of identifying, investigating, and trafficking. The third leg of that mission is to address the needs. While law enforcement is not a service provider, right? So we definitely have to partner with agencies that are trained in a trauma-informed perspective to address those needs. And so really relying on that. And so one of the things that we are challenging our victim service providers is to do long-term follow-ups with the individual we come in contact. For a long time, law enforcement, the job was to make cases, make arrests, right? You identify a potential victim, you arrest the perpetrator, and that's kind of where it stops. So for the way we're doing now is we're wanting follow-up from that individual we made contact. So when we make a case in a hotel, I'm charging our victim service providers, tell me what she's doing in 90 days, 180 days, 365 days. You know, I want to know long-term effects of that contact. So it's not just about recovering them, it's about what's happening to them beyond that point in time, right? Because there's one of the biggest challenges for a victim, well, I'll say two. One is dealing with the trauma, right? You got to recover from the trauma somehow, and you really don't recover from it. You just learn how to manage the dysregulation of emotions and behaviors. Then the second part of that is how do you create economic empowerment for that individual so that they're not having to rely on things that they know, right? And the one thing that they only know is selling themselves. And so that's a challenge.
And I definitely like to build on that, especially the economic empowerment piece. So for example, with our work with survivors of human trafficking, we have a public health response that addresses short-term emergency shelter and medical and mental care needs. So with our case management platform, we get public health referrals essentially. We get them from homeless shelters, those who cross-screen for domestic violence and human trafficking, and also medical and mental health kind of referrals from the Harris Health System. So we then do screenings, provide case management, intensive case management. With that comes access to shelter. Since we've started the program, in 2018, we've served over 350 survivors. With that, we've provided over 10,000 nights of shelter, and as of the last count, 90 individuals have secured long-term housing. And it's really important to have that stabilizing force, as I said earlier. On the economic empowerment piece, we were realizing that, okay, we can get clients with long-term housing, if it's coordinated access, rapid rehousing, get them federally subsidized housing. What about jobs? What about long-term empowerment, long-term resiliency? So actually in January, we hired an economic empowerment associate whose sole task is to work with our survivors of both trafficking and domestic violence to secure them jobs. There are 3 ways that we engage survivors. One is through tailored job matches with the associate and the survivor. The other is through informational sessions where we have a partnership actually with a particular hotel chain where they do an information session and have direct access to hiring managers, or there's more entrepreneurial assistance. And actually, since we've started that, it's gone through a pilot phase. And at last count, 11 survivors had secured long-term employment, so paid employment with benefits. And we find that's the best way, housing, economic empowerment, to ensure that resiliency so they don't fall back.
Several years ago, there was a big push for the decriminalization of prostitution. So with that, the Harris County District Attorney's Office, under, I'm not sure if it fell under John Stalling or Anderson at the time, but they created what's called Project 180. So what Project 180 is a program that the DA's office got with us and said, hey, look, this is what we want to do as far as decriminalization of prostitution. Whenever you get a girl and she's selling herself, we charge her with prostitution. Well, what the DA's office said was, hey, look, why don't we try to work with them because she made an outcry, not to the law enforcement while we had her in custody, but maybe 3 weeks down the road. She made an outcry to the DA investigator or the prosecutor, and they were able to gather information about the trafficker. So now we don't want to charge that victim with the crime of prostitution, which is a Class 3 misdemeanor. At that time it was, now it's I'll backtrack on that. So what Project 180 is, it's a program that offers the victim an opportunity to provide information to law enforcement and to the DA's office about their trafficker. And they also have to go to forensic interviews. There's a couple other stipulations.
Counseling, case management,
yeah. So they have to meet all this criteria to successfully say that they were a part of Project 180 and that they got out of it. So once they complete all that criteria, then the DA's office will drop that charge and won't file on him for the prostitution charge.
And DA is district attorney.
District
right?
attorney, yes.
Okay,
I'm
so-
sorry, I'm using these acronyms.
Okay, so given that, what would you say with the current trends? What can y'all predict about what the Houston human trafficking scene might look like in 5 years?
Hold you into that. Start off.
It's a tough finish up.
I think, it's really difficult and it's very hard to speculate. So, for example, our office started more or less in 2015. I doubt anyone in 2010 would say, I see on the horizon a municipal response by the city of Houston and more municipalities engaging in the trafficking response. If I'm looking at kind of 5 years on, I don't know exactly where trends are going, but what I would like to see is more procurement-based approaches to address human trafficking. So actually, there were several instances of labor trafficking occurring along supply chains. For example, we're talking about Hurricane Katrina. There was the signal case of Indian nationals being trafficked for their labor, working off oil and gas assets. Actually, you had trafficking cases come up in the hospitality and education industry as a result of Katrina. So those traditional due diligence approaches really didn't work in that instance. So kind of in the wake of this, when Harvey hit, Mayor Turner signed an executive order to combat this potential in the city supply chain. We want to make sure we're doing business with responsible contractors and subcontractors, and there's no exploitation in our supply chain. What I would like to see is more corporations and businesses adopting responsible procurement policies. We were actually doing risk mitigation presentations in the aftermath of Hurricane Harvey from 2017 to 2018, and we actually hosted a conscientious capitalism supply chain panel at the Hobby Center in 2018 to really reach corporations as well as consular offices about really it makes business sense to mitigate that risk in your supply chain, whether you're Chevron or whether you're any kind of oil and gas company or whether you do business with a supply chain. There's really, by adopting a policy, you're making a local impact, but you're touching globally because that supply chain is global.
Anything to add?
So it's kind of hard to predict what's going on. The recent trends in recent years are that human trafficking is on the rise. And with Houston being a hub for trafficking and narcotics, my only speculation is that it's going to continue to rise. One thing that has changed in the just recently, as of last month, is the enhancement of buying prostitution has went from a Class B misdemeanor to a felony now. So my presumption is that you'll see less prostitution in the streets where law enforcement can easily catch it, and it's going to go more underground, more maybe online, and maybe inside some illicit businesses. So that's my anticipation.
I agree. It's hard to predict. I think one of the greatest challenges is for community awareness in this topic. And I say that not just from the perspective of here's human trafficking, here's what it looks like. It's the reality of what that really is. I mean, for generations and generations and generations, most people in society would say you have two consenting adults exchanging money for sex. Leaving violence out of it, leaving the trauma out of it, and all of the aspect of that piece of it. And so when law enforcement in the early days, and I remember early days of this, when law enforcement was trying to address this, the community was resistant because they were looking at, well, these are two consenting adults exchanging money for sex. There are more violent crimes occurring out there, not realizing the violence. And so they would actually talk to law enforcement and say, you should be spending your energy and resources and time with these other more violent cases and not really paying attention to it. So the community needs to understand it from a perspective of what it really is. We have to grasp the reality of the violence associated with it and the dangers associated with that, especially with our youth. So I think that's one element too. And I do agree with Robert. I think that we're going to see a trajectory of change with the penalties for buyers now. All right, so you're going to see, most people would say, well, this is a woman's problem. It's really not a woman's problem. It's a man's problem, right? It's basic economics. There's a supply, there's a demand. And if you try to kill off the demand, you're going to reduce the possibility of supply, right? So that's the positive aspect of it. Now we're going to talk about the negative aspect of that, right? So what we've been talking about tonight is the fact that we have kids who are vulnerable because they come from situations of abuse or neglect or whatever, right? a lot of times, not all times, but a lot of times they come from single parent families where the dad's not there, right? So now you have men who are being arrested for prostitution or potentially going to jail. What do you have at home? Kids without dads. So you're creating vulnerability. So there's always a catch to everything that we do. And whenever you do things, when we started implementing new procedures and protocols for the cities and the county to address massage parlors, they changed the way they operated. Like I said, they're going more underground. And so there's always a response to the things we do. So again, it really comes back to the community and how the community is aware and how we can combat it from that perspective. That's going to be one of the key elements to this.
So if anyone does suspect something, where should they go to report it?
There are several avenues. They can make a phone call to Crime Stoppers. Crime Stoppers even has a website you can go to, and you can be anonymous. You can type in your complaint or your tip, leave addresses, whatever information you have. You can call up to our Vice Division. You can call the police station. You can call any number of advocacy groups. There are many avenues to use.
And then no matter where you are, what state, you can always call the National Human Trafficking Hotline. So we would definitely be remiss if we didn't say the number at some point. So 1-888-373-7888. And then of course those tips go to either FBI, HSI, but also the YHPD as far as the last reporting protocol.
Correct. Yeah.
What's HSI?
Oh, Homeland Security Investigations.
Yeah. So that the calls go in there, and then they're routed out to different agencies depending on their jurisdictions. There's a new program starting in the state of Texas, starting January 1. It'll be a thing called iWatch Texas, and it'll actually be an online reporting tool and also a phone number where you can actually speak to law enforcement in the state of Texas, and so you can have direct access to law enforcement that way. And this is really for a statewide effort because there's a lot of areas in law enforcement agencies who don't have task forces. They don't have specialized training in human trafficking. So this will give us more tools for those smaller agencies to have access to services.
So I'd actually now like to turn it over to the audience. If there's any questions from you guys, you can just, yes.
You talked about victims that are groomed, trained, become, and change their behavior. You also said some of them come from good families. So don't the families go out and look for them or search for them or try and do something?
I'll repeat the question just so everyone can hear. You guys had mentioned the process of being groomed. Most of them might come from abusive households, but there are some that come from good families. Don't their families go out to look for them and try and find signs to prevent it?
Absolutely. Mind if I take it?
Yeah, you guys go right ahead.
Okay. So yes, there are instances where the child does come from a good home. It usually takes somewhat of a quick instant where a trafficker recognizes that this girl, maybe he met her at a party and he drugs her and he takes her for a weekend and he keeps her drugged up at a hotel and she's being trafficked that whole weekend, maybe even for a week or two. And sometimes we get tips really quick and we jump on them, and sometimes we find the girl, sometimes we don't. Just depends on how quickly we get that information. But yes, those are the instances where we find out that the girl came from a good home. She just got caught in a bad situation.
And then no matter what home they come from, whether it's high income, low income, most likely the youth uses social media and has social media access. And we know that's definitely one avenue through which they make contact, they lure them in, they groom them. So if you are a parent or caregiver, or whether you just have it in your life, there's a really excellent resource by Love 146, kind of an internet safety guide for parents and caregivers and youth. And it provides a really good detailed list of all the social media apps and potential pitfalls to teach.
And again, it goes back to the community understanding what to look for in a situation, because a lot of times in the use of social media, the way that they craft the messaging within the social media to the girl is a way of the girl's running away. And so you're looking at evidence of what the situation is, and she gets labeled as a runaway, not a traffic victim. And it's such a whole different chain of events. And so, yeah, you have the parents who do that. And so it's a night-day difference when it comes to the response. In fact, we just had a case not too long ago where I got a call from a mom in Spring. She was actually knew who the pimp was that took her. The last phone location was up outside of Dallas. And so because it's a jurisdictional thing, it wasn't falling in with the HPD. and this was now going to be going in Dallas, I contacted the Texas Department of Public Safety Criminal Investigation Division, and I contacted the lieutenant there and said, hey, do you have a contact with the Dallas region? And he said, yeah, this lieutenant, contacted the other lieutenant, gave him all the information I had to this case. That was at 5 o'clock in the afternoon, and at 8 o'clock in the morning they recovered that girl in Dallas and arrested the man. And so it can happen very quickly depending on what information we have. A lot of times information is not there, and that makes it difficult, but the more information we have, the better response we can give.
You hit on something, Dennis, that sparked a memory. How many of you guys have ever seen a sign like in a cross section, an intersection that says looking for babysitters or part-time work for young females or young kids? I see them all the time. Those are known trafficking phone numbers. So, if you know kids that are looking for work, don't call those numbers.
Yes.
It was shocking to me when Mr. Dennis said that women who are victims will defend the criminal, the pimp, or whoever they're called. But would you say they possibly may have Stockholm syndrome and their pimp is depriving them from those basic needs, so they're submissive to them?
So the question was, it was really shocking to hear that women defend their abusers, captors, pimps, whatever you want to call it. Would you say, Dennis, to a degree, that they might be suffering from Stockholm syndrome? And is it quite common, I guess, within victims to...
Yeah, we didn't get to go through the different stages of the grooming process. And one of those stages is the seduction phase, right? And the seduction phase is to show the best of who you are, right? In fact, I worked with some other agencies who would create a curriculum for school that said, hey, we got this list of people that you do want to hang out with, if you don't want to hang out with. I said, this is great. The pimp is going to be the nice guy until he's not, right? And so that's the situation. And so in the mind of a victim, and again, this is coming from direct conversations with victims, that process of grooming, because there is such a relationship established, a connection established with that person, when the violence comes, and the brain doesn't know how to respond to violence when it's done by somebody they trust. The brain literally doesn't know how to respond to that. And so they're shocked. They're literally shocked by, why is this person who I care for doing this to me now? And so they don't know how to respond to it. But in their mind, because the guy will probably most likely, when he's violent, will also turn around and go, I'm sorry, I did this to you, whatever. So she has a memory, this guy is good. I just got to stay with this, and it was probably my fault, or whatever the case. Domestic violence and human trafficking run parallel. And so that's kind of why. So they do defend it because there's a connection there, and they don't have any other options, really.
I think we have time for one more question, so yes.
In all of those individual fields, what's one thing that you wish to be implemented specifically for your work on those certain types of legislation, funding, manpower, just simple awareness? What's one thing you would like in your field of your job easier?
So the question was, each of you all, what would you say would be one thing, whether that's manpower, more funding, I guess people more aware? What's one thing you get that would make your job a little bit easier? Because I know it's not an easy job as is.
So I would say for me, for my field, and so you have to understand that in my unit, I supervise six detectives who are tasked with investigating human trafficking investigations throughout the city of Houston, and we also overlap into the Harris County and the surrounding counties. So yes, more manpower would absolutely do me good.
I think also if we can think maybe international in scope, there's the standard Palermo protocol, that governs most trafficking responses. Prosecution, partnerships, prevention, and then I'm missing one, Dennis.
Mm-hmm.
I'm missing one of the P's.
Yeah, you missed one of the P's.
But
oh my gosh, what is it?
That's okay. But anyway, so oftentimes trafficking can be more or less, focused on a law enforcement response. Mm-hmm. I think it would be good if we broaden the discussion to also include a public health response, and really addressing both not only those referral streams, but understanding trafficking as a human rights and public health issue that needs a public health response. And that's why we kind of did our services platform the way that we did, with the community-based assessment and then the social service supports.
So funding is number one, right? That's always going to be number one because there's never enough money, especially compared to the amount of money that's generated by labor trafficking and sex trafficking. That's astronomical. We can't get into that discussion right now, because that's a whole other topic. So funding is always important, and especially when it comes to services and victims. I come from that field where the number of victims is astronomically larger than the number of beds available to them. Right? At one point in time, there were only 1,900 beds dedicated to human trafficking victims in the United States. There were 6,500 animal shelters in the country, but there were only 1,900 beds, right? So that's horrible, right? So that's one element to it. The other aspect of this, and this is the shortfall that I would think pretty much every agency in the country that does victim services, especially long-term residential care, is you're looking at least a minimum of 24 months of care in a highly intensive program to help them start recovering from trauma. The really shortfall there is people. People doing that work, and it's not fun work. I've done that work for 15 years, 7.5 years in the safe house, living 24/7 with victims, right? And the amount of trauma that they experience, nothing you can do can prepare you for that environment, because you will suffer trauma from their trauma. It's just going to happen, right? And so I think a lot of people walk into that experience with really good intentions and really high expectations, and then reality punches them in the face. Most shelters that open up now for victims of trafficking, they open up and 1 year later they're closed because they have not realized the effects of what trauma has done to these individuals. And so that piece of it, I think we need people who are committed to the cause, and it's a hard cause, but it's one of the things that's the largest shortfalls.
And I think as far as kind of more funding is needed, I think also oftentimes mindsets can get in the way of a trafficking response. To give you one example, oftentimes, so we have an emergency shelter program. We don't have a dedicated trafficking shelter. We leverage existing resources. So for example, we have 2 shelters. One's at a homeless shelter, one's at a domestic violence shelter. Oftentimes we had heard nationally, it's not a best practice to house trafficking victims at a domestic violence shelter. It's not a best practice to house trafficking victims with homeless. But by leveraging those resources, we mitigate the funding issue, right? And you can still have a robust trafficking response. So oftentimes you have to leverage, and taking one more example, by leveraging those existing shelter resources, you tap into existing housing resources. So for example, oftentimes we talk about funding, but through innovation and leveraging what's already there, you can oftentimes get a really good response.
Amazing. Thank you all so much, Dennis, Chris, and Sergeant Medel. I really appreciate you guys agreeing to sit on our panel, and I'm sure I can speak maybe on behalf of the audience, but it's absolutely mind-blowing hearing all of the wealth of knowledge that you guys had. Just to reiterate, my name is Tatiana Euclid. I'm one of the program coordinators for the World Affairs Council of Greater Houston. We hope you, I don't want to say enjoyed is the right word, but we hope you appreciated tonight's program, and we hope to see you again on October 28th for our program with Dr. Kelsey Norman to talk about who's responsible for the world's refugees. You can go ahead and check out our website, wachhouston.org, to find more of the information about that. Thank you guys again, and I hope you guys have a good night. I think the gentlemen might be sticking around a few minutes to answer any questions you might have, but they also have families and stuff to get home to. So yeah, thank you guys again. Thank you. 2 minutes.
No.